Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. One of the things thinking and talking and writing so much about the current American moment has impressed on me is just how much danger other countries in the developed world are of a similar collapse in liberal democratic institutions, which is what I believe we are witnessing in real time in America. As many of you will know, I'm a dual national American-British citizen. I've lived in both countries for extended periods. I'm in the UK right now. And I really do think, as I look at our politics, that we are not that far from something like that here as well. We have a little bit more time than America does, but in many ways, we are much less prepared and much less resilient against something like that here. It would not surprise me at all if our next election or the election after was something of 2016, an uninspiring centrist who has simultaneously failed to win converts on the centre-right, while also alienating the left, versus a fascist who is very real and very dangerous, but somehow not taken seriously, considered as a bit of a joke, not a real threat. I don't know that that's what's coming. I can't see the future any more than anyone else can, but it really wouldn't surprise me. And I think we have to make ourselves ready for that. And I really don't know how. And it's not as if that's just some future worry. Xenophobic and racist anti-immigrant fears have driven our politics for a decade and a half now, and we have weakened our economy, our constitution, and our standing in the world chasing them. Real harm has been done to us, never mind to people seeking better lives or fleeing oppression who we know nothing about and have viciously demonised. All of which is to say, I think we have a few years to start speaking plainly, to start, as you'll hear in this episode, trying to cut through the various levels of misinformation that are out there. And I don't really know how we do that other than to use my voice, as small as it is, this is not a massive podcast, to try and call some attention to that. So, as something of a long introduction, stroke preamble, that's why I am going to be increasingly focusing on British and European politics on this podcast. This episode will be the first of a double bill on the immigration debate in the UK, the first looking at the ethical stroke political philosophy side, and the second looking at the electoral political side. So this is more of a values discussion, albeit one that does sort of mention real cases, and then the next one will be on how that interfaces with party coalitions. This episode is with Rebecca Buxton. She is a lecturer in social and political philosophy at the University of Bristol. Her work focuses on displacement, migration, and citizenship. She's also published on women's exclusion from philosophy, including Philosopher Queens, a collection of essays on and by women in philosophy. And as you'll hear in this episode, she has an upcoming volume on the ethics of asylum and immigration. So that was quite a long introduction as to what my motivation for focusing on this is. I think most of my audience are American or international, but hopefully it will be interesting to find out a bit about the politics of another country after having spent quite a lot of time in America on the show. So, apart from to say, if you like the show, please do consider supporting on Patreon, patreon.com/political philosophy podcast, patreon.com/political philosophy podcast, and a big thank you to everyone who does. Let's get straight to it. This is The Ethics of Asylum with Rebecca Buxton. I am joined today by Rebecca Buxton. Rebecca, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks very much for having me. Lovely to be here.
So we're going to do asylum and refugee debate and ethical issues arising therefrom today. This is something we're both in the UK that has been front and centre of our politics for quite some time now, certainly my adult life, I think. What do you think either political theory or political philosophy can bring to the public conversation around these issues?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and one that I struggle with a lot. So one pessimistic thought might be that political philosophy actually can't bring very much to this conversation.
Yeah.
That the conversation has gone so far the other way that it's difficult to speak with people about the question of migration and asylum without thinking that you're just appealing to a kind of totally different set of facts. So, for example, I teach a third year unit on the ethics of migration. In the first lecture, I poll my students on their general attitudes towards migration. And then I show them the attitudes of the British public about migration, just to show them how out of step they are, and I am, with what everybody else thinks. So, for example, the Rwanda policy, the policy that the last Conservative government tried to pursue, where they would essentially kind of nationalise human trafficking and send asylum seekers to Rwanda to be processed if they came across the channel in a small boat, but then they would never be able to apply for asylum in the UK. Overwhelmingly, philosophers of migration think that that's a terrible thing, not only practically but morally speaking. But the British public were very supportive of that policy. It was pursued precisely because it was popular. So you might have a kind of very pessimistic view that the kind of terms of the thing that we're trying to discuss are just so different. I'd like to think that there's still a space for doing political philosophy about this topic. So the difficulty is transferring that into something that's like predominant discourse, whatever that might mean. So I think one way of doing that is by allowing us to develop the kinds of conceptual tools to analyze the new policies that we're seeing develop out in the real world. So, for example, overwhelmingly, refugee and asylum policy is turning towards temporary forms of protection where people aren't entitled to citizenship or even permanent residency. States are trying to maintain people in this position of kind of deportability for as long as possible, so that if anything happened, they could be sent back. I think what political philosophy can offer there is kind of giving us the language to explain why that is wrong, why that condition is bad, and why we have obligations of justice to do something else. So it feels diagnostic in a way, rather than being able to develop in this current context, like the idea of a big picture of what justice demands on migration and refuge feels quite far away. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree with the feeling of like, when you do a thing, people often sort of get a question that sort of peters out into what's the political payoff of this. And the answer sometimes is there may not be one. Like sometimes the best you can do is to understand something and to formulate your own views better. And I've talked quite a bit, we won't in this conversation, but about the Trump administration, and the sort of question I always get is, so what's the solution then? And it's like, there might not be one, right? Like this is all sorts of different things are going wrong simultaneously, Here's one thing I think maybe political theory or philosophy can add to this debate, and I'll praise your work for a minute and you'll have to just endure that. Is I do think there's a thing of providing people with frameworks to think with,
Mm.
and those frameworks needn't be elaborate or technical or involve specialized terminology. One thing I've read two of your pieces, one on respect and fairness in Asylum, and one on the idea of gratitude in Asylum. One thing that jumped out to me in both of them was it's a moral analysis, but it's a moral analysis that in both cases centers the perspective of the refugee rather than the host country.
Mhm.
And that just seemed to me right, or at the very least, that when we have this debate, it seems to wholly practically and morally centre the perspective of citizens, or the government in the country that would be hosting. It sort of reminded me of the biblical command, "Do not oppress the stranger, for you were strangers in Egypt." I'm not a huge Bible person, but I quite like that one because it's got two sides. It's got the justice, "Do not oppress," which is, I think, how liberals say might view immigration as like, let's not do harm to others, let's provide aid to others. But it's got this other side of empathy, which is, you were strangers in Egypt. If you go back far enough, this was it might, for some of you, that might be parents, grandparents, great, but you go back far enough for anyone, and this was you. And this could be you again. And to ask not just for justice, but to see yourself in that person. And I think that, even in the more liberal approaches to immigration, is so missing. And I thought both of your works, we can get into the specifics of them, did that.
Mm.
And that's maybe one thing that theory or philosophy can bring is, like I say, not in a huge or elaborate or technical way, but in a, hey, try looking at it like this sort of way.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think so. I'm in the process of writing the conclusion of a co-authored book. So some of my work is on LGBTQ displacement, and we've had a kind of book contract in place for a while, and we're in the kind of final throes of finishing that. We started writing it in 2020, and we're obviously finishing writing it in a very different position to the one that we started it in. So it felt as though we were planning to tell a story of, like, look, the asylum regime has kind of slowly expanded throughout the last 30 years, and protections for LGBTQ people, for women, have like started to come in, but they're not really secure in the way that we want them to be. What would full inclusion look like? And now the context is like the very things that we took as foundational are up for grabs again. So the very question of whether or not states should admit refugees at all, or basic questions of gender equality, equality on the basis of sexual identity and gender orientation, are now like up in the air in a way that they maybe weren't a few years ago. In that context, it feels like political theory and what we're doing in the book is like a kind of damage control project. You're trying to give reasons for securing the things that we thought were secure already. But I think you're exactly right that it's almost like trying to give us the tools that maybe we're not going to use them. They're not going to kind of come to fruition right now, but having those tools is productive. So even if the contextual terrain has shifted, there is something that we can get a grip on. And it is also just useful to understand how badly wrong things have gone. So even if everything keeps getting worse, the political philosopher's job is to kind of provide an alternative way through, even if it really feels like you're pushing against the political winds much more than you used to be. I mean, it's frustrating in the context of like the UK government's immigration policy, where so I've written a little bit about um, whether or not states have an obligation to offer citizenship to refugees. I think that they do, especially after a prolonged period in the state of asylum. The UK government has recently changed the regulations, so they updated what they call the kind of good character qualifications for British citizenship to include not having come into the country illegally, or irregularly is the proper terminology for someone who actually does get refugee status. And what that means is that anybody who's given refugee status in the country who in fact first came in through something like the route across the Channel now can never qualify for British citizenship. So you have a whole group of people who we've agreed, the Home Office even agreed, that they are refugees, they have a well-founded fear of persecution, but they're going to be in this kind of position of political alienation forever. There's no way for them to secure citizenship in the UK. So even under a Labour government, things are getting much worse on immigration, I think. And that's kind of extra frustrating in a way that maybe I shouldn't have expected better, but I did sort of expect that it would be slightly better.
Let's stay with the Labour government. I was going to start with theory, but let's do it the other way round. Let's go from practice first, because I have stuff to say on this. And I say this as a lifelong Labour voter, like an ancestral Labour voter. My mum, my granddad, I don't think either of them would ever have put their ballot next to anything else, right? So I'm not either a Conservative or, there are people on the left who only ever snipe at the Labour Party. I'm in neither of those camps. I really feel they, for a variety of reasons, have not taken the right approach on this. I think, we talked about frameworks. I think they have not only tacitly but explicitly accepted the premise of the Brexit project and of various far-right elements in our society, that the number one challenge facing the country is that too many people are coming in, and that the job of this government is to reduce that number through whatever means. And that is a premise that they cannot justify. And when they're asked to justify, it's amazing how little they have to say on it, other than just they imagine, maybe correctly, it's what the electorate wants. But they can't justify it. And I find that interesting, that a Farage could justify it. He would have all sorts of things to say about that. But Starmer can't. So what he has put before the electorate as the central metric on which he is asking them to justify himself, he can't explain why he thinks it's a good thing. I find that a bizarre position to be in, and it makes me quite depressed.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. So I'm also a lifelong Labour voter. In fact, I used to work for a Labour MP for a year and a half, and that what's so frustrating is precisely that you get a kind of the Greens and the Lib Dems to some extent and Plaid Cymru are making this positive case for immigration, and I think that was what was fascinating about the debates in the election that we just had when questions of immigration were raised, is that they were willing to say, look, immigration is a good thing for this country. We might not have the right infrastructure, we might not have enough housing, but it's not the immigrants that are the problem. It's not immigration that's the problem, or at least not at the scale that Farage thinks it is. The Conservatives had a story about why it was bad. Farage had a story about why it was bad. Keir Starmer seems to think that it's, what's frustrating is he seems so focused on electability that he's forgotten that he was elected, albeit kind of a wide but shallow Labour victory, right? So
but still,
I think
the metric by which we elect government is seats. He won a lot of seats.
Yeah.
You can say it wasn't with a large percentage of the vote, but that's not how we elect governments. By the rules of the game, he won the game. You have power,
Yeah, I think they're so scared of there's sort of no sense of like moral backbone to what they're doing on immigration at all. And I find like the kind of, I mean, at the moment they're mimicking the kinds of videos that are coming out of the US of like ICE immigration detention and people being rounded up onto planes. Like they release videos of people being rounded up and with sort of blurred faces being pulled out of their houses and stuff. And it's so inhumane. And you would think that a lifelong public servant, as he called it, he would understand. Like I thought he would understand in a way that I thought there would at least be some kind of sense of morality to our immigration policy, even if it was still going to roughly stay the same. So you're right, they've adopted this central premise of immigration bad, small, and they're kind of saying like, look, I'm not doing stop the boats, I'm doing smash the gangs, and that to some extent that shifts the unit of analysis. Like we're focusing on the people smugglers instead of the people
Yeah,
crossing.
David Lammy called it progressive realism, so I guess the word progressive is in there. You know,
Oh no, yeah. I mean, progressive in what sense? Like, I don't. There's no. I mean, so the immigration figures actually came out today, and they've shown that there was I think almost no change on boat crossings, but a really big dip in visas being issued for health and social care workers and visas being issued for international students, two sectors that are not doing particularly well. So and they're also kind of spillovers of conservative policy. So that doesn't seem to be anything that the Labour government has introduced. It was the very restrictive visa regimes that were introduced just before the election are finally having an effect. And what that means is that actually the overall immigration numbers are going to start coming down, but the cost of that is that we will have a higher education sector that is crumbling, and a health and social care sector that doesn't have enough staff to look after people.
our health and social care sector, I have some personal experience with this in the form of older relatives, has a lot of very, very good people in it who I think are there vocationally and very good. It is hanging on by a thread, if at all. Like the resources and the staff are just not there. And look, the Conservatives aren't wrong when they say we have falling birth rates and an aging population. That is going to mean more people in need of cancer and dementia and Alzheimer's care. And this is just the thing, isn't it? Right? Like, governments don't just set up, we did X. They signal to electorates, here's the things we think are important and we're asking you to judge us on. And like, it's fine to say that the Tories missed their own immigration targets, that's true enough, but they're the wrong targets. Like, the measure of a country's success is whether it's healthy and happy and prosperous, not if an arbitrary number of people cross a border. Like, I wish someone nationally could say that. I think they feel that they can't. But public opinion can also follow parties. I mean, look in the States, you've gone from 3% to 33% approval of Putin. That's because the Republicans have messaged that. There's no reason the left can't do that. It's a matter of courage.
Yeah, I agree totally. I think they think that it's like a kind of fundamentally unchangeable fact about the British public that they hate immigration, and it's actually just that there's no alternative story being told about why immigration is good. But there's also a failure to correct people at the level of fact. So like Nigel Farage sort of has a very simple story about kind of, look, we have this many jobs and this many people are coming in and they're taking up all those jobs, and that's the problem. It's immigration that's the problem. That's just a complete fallacy of sort of how the labour market works. There's not like one big lump of jobs that doesn't move with the number of people who come in, or that immigrants don't themselves create new jobs. So the difficulty is the story that you have to tell in response to somebody like him is complicated, and he's able to tell a simple lie and get away with it. But no one's providing that alternative way of thinking about immigration at the moment.
No, they're not. And to maybe bring us back towards the theory side of things, the argument I just gave, while correct, is, again, like I said at the beginning, very much centering British people, and fine, British people are people too, but I'm saying, like, actually our country probably needs reasonably high levels of immigration, and actually something like the EU where people can come and work for a few years, maybe leave, maybe come back, whatever, that was quite good for us, That's the sort of argument about what's in the national interest. And what I complimented your work on was sort of centering the experience of a refugee, because as you talked about, being kept on hold maybe indefinitely for citizenship, being constantly left vulnerable to deportation, all of these things, where my mind goes is I really think decision makers and analysts can look very hard at like economics and cost and so on and ignore this other currency of people's status, of people's feelings of self-respect or humiliation and so on and so forth. I think that's just a huge part of what makes people's lives good or bad, essentially, and that gets neglected. And your papers really centered that. You set up a dichotomy, I think it was between respect and fairness. Do you want to sort of explain that and how it applies to the refugee or asylum system?
Yeah, good. So the paper's about asylum adjudication. So how we determine who is a refugee and who isn't a refugee. The way that we do that globally is through something called the refugee status determination interview. That can be done by individual states. Sometimes it's done by UNHCR. And the paper is meant to ask, okay, how do we do this interview well? What kinds of values do we need to think about? And the two values that I set up are fairness and respect, because they seem to pull in two different directions on the question of interviews. So in asylum interviews at the moment, people seeking asylum are often asked really horrible questions. They have to share deeply upsetting stories about the kind of persecution that they faced or might face in the future, as well as especially LGBTQ refugees face kind of horrible questions about their sexuality, where they have to kind of prove their sexual orientation to the immigration judge. And I basically tried to diagnose the reason why those interview questions are so probing is because we have what I call a fairness first system, where we're trying to basically catch out bad actors. So the idea of asylum adjudication, at least as it works in the UK context, is to catch quote unquote bogus asylum seekers. But that even a very idealized system that prioritizes fairness would require very extensive information in order to make judgments. And I basically borrow this idea from Joe Wolf. So he sets up this idea of systems that place too much value on fairness. So his idea is the welfare system. So in order for the welfare system to be fair, we need lots of information about the people who are trying to claim. In particular, we need to figure out, whether they're lazy, talentless, all sorts of things that humiliating for people to have to talk about, why they're sick, whether they've applied for jobs. So there's this kind of epistemic thing that goes on in a fairness first system, where you try to excavate as much information as possible, and that's disrespectful, right? So there's this other value which seems to be in competition with fairness in this context, which is respect. And the diagnosis of the paper is to try and say we've just put respect totally to the side because we're just thinking about fairness. So what would a more dynamic system look like if we were trying to balance fairness and respect? And I basically end up giving three different possibilities. One is where you kind of ask all of the same questions, but you just do so in a slightly more quote unquote respectful way. Another is the idea that you change the questions that you ask asylum seekers to try and balance this set of constraints. So, for instance, LGBTQ asylum seekers, you don't ask them very explicit questions about how they have sex, for instance, which seems like a low bar, but and some of the policy has started to catch up with this idea in the last few years. And then the last suggestion, which I sort of put in as a speculative one, is that in lots of cases, maybe we just don't need to interview people, and we can do it through forms, self-declaration, recorded videos where people give whatever evidence they would like to. And we don't need to have this kind of very combative system that tries to extract as much information as possible. So I think the idea is that we've focused too much attention on the wrong value, and in fact there are lots of values that we need to try to balance in the case of asylum.
Yeah, it seems to me like, and this would map across a number of different systems, as you said, but immigration and asylum systems, in the reality of practice, it's not just that they emphasize fairness. I'm not sure if you had a system that sort of said, we have this many places, we want to ensure they go to the most deserving, however that's defined, people. Um, it's kind of like a pathology of fairness in which the concern isn't to ensure a finite resource is well distributed. The concern is to catch out free riders and punish bad actors. And like, it seems like this system, and you honestly could mention domestic programs like welfare systems in the same breath, has kind of become a pathology that's consumed everything else. Like the point of these systems isn't to distribute a resource and that will involve filtering out bad claims. The point of these systems is to find out bad claims. Like that, like the tails wagging the dog or whatever seems very much my impression of them. Like almost as a paper that's very critical of existing systems, I almost wondered if you were being too charitable on them.
Yeah, I think probably. I mean, there's a sense in which, so there's different ways to think about fairness to whom. And in the paper, I talk about the kind of articulation of the history of British refugee policy being like, we're famous for a long, they call it a long and proud history of offering asylum, which is just a myth. Like we have a terrible history of offering asylum. And so there's this quote from Suella Braverman in the paper, which I think she says something like, the British public are famously a fair and patient people, but we're being taken for a ride. So it's this idea of the free rider that's the real problem, and that we're so obsessed with a kind of Thatcherism where you're like really just trying to single out the people who are screwing us over, and you're doing that to such an extent that you're failing to see any of the other people in the room at all. So you're perfectly happy to harm all of these people who do have genuine claims in pursuit of this one like imaginary person. And I think what's interesting in the paper is, or what I struggled with in the paper to some extent, and when I was presenting it around, is like, obviously people lie in their asylum interviews. The stakes are incredibly high. If they don't get in, they might be killed in their home country. So under those kinds of conditions, I would probably lie, or kind of reframe how I'm describing events. Or so what I don't think we need to deny in order to get a better system is that there will be free riders, however you want to understand that claim. Like there are people who maybe don't have as much of a need for international protection as some others, but I think that that's basically a price that we should be willing to pay for a more inclusive asylum system. And if you really think that bogus asylum seekers are a problem, you could have, for instance, a very expansive refugee resettlement program where you go and select people from refugee camps and offer them asylum. If you're worried that they're not getting to the front of the queue, you could go and get them, but we don't do that. So we use this idea of like the queue in British asylum policy as a way of delegitimizing the people who've made it to the UK, but not as a reason to go and help people who we would conceptualize as being at the back of the queue.
Yeah, I talk a lot about American politics, and there's been a lot of hand-wringing, correctly so, about sort of a post-truth age, a post-fact age. One point I've made, though, is while it's certainly the case that Trump lies and lies pathologically in a way that's unusual even for a politician, the idea that, like, big factually incorrect claims occupying a lot of space in our politics is nothing new. British politics, my entire life, has revolved around the claim that fraud in the welfare system is a huge driver of costs, and that's where most of your tax is going, or that asylum seekers or immigrants claim a huge amount of benefits when they come here, and that's where your tax is going. These are descriptively untrue statements. Every bit as much as Trump claiming that his skyscrapers have more stories than they actually do is a descriptively untrue statement. But they're not considered wacko or fringe in the way I guess Trump at least used to be, perhaps no longer is. And indeed, they're something that commands a bipartisan consensus across the parties, but it doesn't suddenly make them descriptively true. Like, what's changed is the types of false claims that are getting thrown around and how outlandish and grotesque perhaps they are. But the idea that politics was a sort of gentlemanly thing where we all agreed on facts is, I think, a little naive, right?
Yeah, for sure. So I totally agree with that, and I think that's feels like it's especially the case for immigration, that it's not
especially,
the true. Yeah, it's not true that we live in this kind of particularly anti-immigrant moment, although I think it's worse to some extent. But there was never kind of a rosy time when everybody loved immigration. It's just that we hated different immigrants back then to the ones that people hated now, and I think people just. So I think you're right that what has changed is kind of the way in which those are received or mainstreamed, or who's responding to them and on what terms. So like what Nigel Farage seems to be able to successfully do is shape the policy of the Labour Party, even though he's the MP for Clacton. And he's got so much more power over the agenda of the government than most Labour MPs do, because he's a threat to them. And so he can throw out all of these falsehoods, and to some extent, to disagree with him at the level of fact isn't going to help you to stay in power. So, for instance, Trump signed another executive order the other day, which basically banned undocumented migrants in the US from getting a social security number. It's impossible for undocumented people to get a social security number. So this will save $0. So there's no, unless like they're kind of so fantastic at fraud that they're managing to get fake documents and all this stuff. And there's a really interesting commentary from someone who used to work on social security, who said, in 20 years, I've never come across an undocumented migrant who's managed to do this. So there's kind of, at the level of like, these kinds of claims are just, but what's difficult is I don't know how to diagnose those kinds of things, whether or not the people who do that believe that it will make a difference. Does Donald Trump and his cabinet or whoever genuinely believe that there are thousands of illegal immigrants claiming social security? Or do they not care whether or not that's true, but they're saying it because they know that it's a spectacle and that it appeals to their base? It doesn't matter. It's like the kind of Frankfurtian idea of bullshit, but it doesn't matter whether or not people believe it. There's no attempt at making a truthful claim there. They're just doing something else.
In the case of Donald Trump specifically, he has an epistemology. I mean, he wouldn't use that. Let me try and put this in non-philosophical terms. Donald Trump, I think, sincerely doesn't have the same conception of truth that was operative in the sentence you just said. Like, truth isn't generated to him. Truth is generated to him by what people believe. Mm. Like when he's asked to justify stuff, he says lots of people believe it. Mm. Like, and my people, the right people, the white, Christian, rural people, suburban people, they believe it. The real Americans believe it. That's what something is true in virtue of in his head. So like, does he think it's true, or is it like, just propaganda? I don't think, in a weird way, I don't think he makes that distinction. Yeah. Which is kind of terrifying in its own right, but that's another story. And by the way, for American listeners, which is most of my audience, Nigel Farage is leader of we have a quasi-multi-party system in the UK. Nigel Farage is the leader of our far-right party, which rather confusingly changes its name every few years. But he's kind of a force to the right of even our Conservatives, although the Conservatives are trying their best to capture his voters. Anyway, back at the ranch, I think, returning to refugees, there's a conception, even amongst sort of liberal and fine with immigration people, as allowing people in as an act of charity, something we do for them, to which we can feel good about themselves and they should be grateful.
Yeah.
You critique that they do not need to be grateful. Why not?
Yeah, good. So this was a paper that I wrote with my, well, it was my PhD supervisor, but then once I finished my PhD, we started working on this paper on whether refugees owe a duty of gratitude to their state of asylum. And what we do in the paper is we basically accept for the sake of argument that there might be such a thing as a duty of gratitude, although there might be reasons for thinking that that's suspicious on the face of it. And what we do is we basically examine the workings of the refugee protection system as a whole. And once you look at the whole picture, it becomes very clear that no such duty could exist in the real world of asylum as it works today. So our main concern in the paper is basically the way in which states actively try to impede refugees from seeking asylum through visa sanctions, carrier sanctions, which is when they penalise private companies like air and travel companies for letting people without the proper documentation onto their planes, which they would need to do in order to seek asylum. Like the EU has a kind of border police force called Frontex, which makes it very difficult for people to seek asylum. And in the context where states are actively trying to prevent people from seeking asylum, it then seems very difficult to say that refugees owe a duty of gratitude to that state once they've been let in. So one of the examples that we have throughout the paper is this idea of being saved from a burning building. So you might think that if you're saved from a burning building and there's like a firefighter, you would be grateful to the firefighter for dragging you out of the burning building. But then there's lots of other kind of conditions you could put on that make it look slightly more like the refugee regime. So if you were in a burning building and the firefighter was kind of actively making it very difficult for you to get out of the burning building, difficult for you and everybody else to get out of the burning building. And then at the last moment, just as you'd basically made it, they dragged you just the extra couple of feet and then said, "Oh, aren't you grateful that I pulled you out of that burning building?" That seems just like such a different framework for thinking about duties of gratitude. So the aim there again is to kind of situate the debate in the kind of actual reality of asylum policy. So we're, in a sense, the argument in that paper isn't quite as theoretical. It's more like, okay, once you actually pay attention to this world, the world that we've created for asylum seekers and refugees, this kind of claim that they have a duty to be grateful to us seems to just collapse into nothing. So we start the paper with a quote from Tucker Carlson, where he claims that Ilhan Omar has a duty to be grateful to America because her parents were rescued from a refugee camp, and so was she. But that duty to be grateful seems to kind of persist throughout her entire life, such that she can never criticize America. And what was interesting was, so when that piece was published, when I was still on Twitter, which I've since left,
I think we all have.
Yeah, everybody's got. I didn't realise what a party everybody was having over on Blue Sky. So I feel like
small victories. We managed to coordinate a bit of an exodus there. So
yeah.
anyway,
So I was on Twitter still at the time, and I think the Journal posted the piece and a quick summary of it. And I got fully dogpiled by horrible right-wing anti-immigrant accounts. I was called a race traitor. I got death threats, like the level of vitriol, that even suggesting that maybe people don't have this duty to feel a particular way to their state of asylum. It was like they couldn't have imagined me saying anything worse.
I've been called a race traitor before. That's fun, isn't it?
Yeah.
This was in the American context, but at some point I couldn't even feel particularly strongly about it. It's like your concerns are so alien to me, I can't even like register them.
Yeah.
At the anyway.
I kind of just couldn't believe. I didn't know if it was like a thing that I could claim to my university as like public engagement and impact. Like it's the biggest response I've ever got to a piece of work that I've published. And I think it was just because one particularly big account basically retweeted the paper.
Yeah.
And then they found my website, and that was that basically. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, for whatever reason, I don't think like the internet and social media unnecessarily have a baked-in ideological bias. I mean, they might do now with Trump, with Musk, and so on. But it is the case that the Nazis have just learned how to use them quite effectively, unfortunately, and they can really sort of punch above their numbers.
Yeah, they're very well organized in a way that I think the left isn't particularly well organized on these kinds of sites. Or like, we spend lots of time talking about what we should do and how we should do it, but not very much time actually doing it. Whereas I feel like
there's a sort of abstract armchair generaling to the left that I have been as guilty of this as anyone, right? This is the Democrats should say this, and I agree that Democrats and Labour's messaging are weak sauce, right? Like, I agree, but at some level we have to get out of our own heads, and instead of saying what if we said the thing, just say the thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's keep this somewhat focused. One of the things you said there was, I'm paraphrasing you, but like once you bring the facts of the situation in, the duty of gratitude sort of evaporates. I think that's true of a big chunk of public attitudes to immigration in the UK. I think there's kind of three camps. The smallest would be, say, genuinely pro-immigrant. The next biggest, or perhaps the biggest, would be people who are genuinely anti-immigrant. Like, facts don't really matter. They walk down the store and they see someone who's clearly of a different ethnicity or faith, and that makes them mad. Like, that's the concern. It's not about fairness. It's about, I don't like that there's a Muslim store down the road from me. That's a big chunk. And then I think there's a big chunk in the middle who kind of just don't get it. That they think the system is much more open and much more generous than it is, and much less humiliating than it in fact is. And they're so entrenched in that reality that you get almost like, when you explain how the system actually works, you get an almost quizzical disbelief.
Yeah.
Like, when I sort of tell people, like, this is what's involved in getting a spousal visa, not even talking about immigration, this is how a British citizen can bring a married partner here. People, they don't quite say it, but I think they often think you're lying because it just sounds so wild.
Yeah.
And to be fair, their attitudes are not insane given what they've been told to believe about the world. If the system was as open and generous as they've been told that it is, then there probably would be an obligation of gratitude. Right? It's not even philosophy, it's just like you have to acclimate your moral response to reality in a way.
Yeah, but I think what's interesting is there's a kind of intentional withholding of that information from people, right? So at Oxford when I was at Oxford there was a immigration detention centre near Bedford called Yarl's Wood. I think it might have recently reopened to house male asylum seekers, but it used to be just women asylum seekers. And what was interesting about Yarlswood is it's kind of kept at it's physically at a distance from the town. Like, it's actually quite difficult to get to. If you didn't know it was there, you wouldn't know it was there. There are no signs, nothing that would give it away. That there are like hundreds of women um, in essentially imprisoned, even though they haven't committed any crime, waiting to be potentially deported, although lots of them weren't deported. So there's this kind of physical removal from the same space. There's a kind of sense in which their perspectives are marginalised to such an extent that nobody ever hears what the women in Yarlswood think, other than people who already know what they think and are trying to kind of elevate their voices. And so I think there's so I think you're right, like to some extent it's not a kind of maliciousness among this big group of people necessarily. They're not intentionally.
There is a somewhat malicious incuriosity.
Right, yeah.
They believe the wrong things for
Yeah.
reasons that aren't necessarily their fault, but they've also not made any effort to find out. I feel very morally ambivalent about it.
Yeah, I think there's a sense in which they don't think there's anything to find something out about, to some extent. Like, you already have to believe that
Yeah.
there's something up in order to go digging for more information, right? Whereas if you just think that everything's fine and dandy, or roughly fine, then what's the problem? So one of the statistics that I like to throw around is that since 1999, the total number of refugees resettled in the world has never gone above 1% of the total number of refugees. So less than 1% of refugees are resettled. Which, when you explain that to someone who thinks that the UK is taking like millions and millions of refugees a year, which obviously we don't, it's like they can't comprehend the scale of the problem, but also they don't understand our contribution. So it's similar to discussions about how much of GDP we spend on international aid. So if you survey the British public and ask them how much do you think we spend on international aid, or at least a few years ago, 15%. It was 0.7% at the time that they were surveyed. So they're just totally off. And it's partly because the debate around it makes it seem like it must be so much more than it actually is. But actually, the debate we're having is about something so small that does so much good.
Although part of that is just that people can't do percentages.
Yeah, yeah.
Go ahead and guess, when polled, what percentage of the population people estimate to be trans.
Oh, well, how much they think, how many people do the population?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say 10.
25.
Wow. They think a quarter of people. but you know lots of people, so presumably you'd think.
It's crackers, isn't it?
Nuts.
But it actually happens across the board. Like, in America, you ask what percentage are Jewish, 35%. It's like 2.
Yeah.
You know, it's less than 2, actually. What percentage are black? You get 50. It's 13. You know, like, if you
but
ask...
there's a sense in which I think that you make those populations appear hyper visible in a way that you think, oh, well, it must be 50% because we're constantly talking about it, blah, blah, blah. Or like in the refugee case, we're like, well, we must be taking millions of refugees, because otherwise why would we be talking about it?
Why would we be talking about it? Yeah. And I think it works the other way, as we've discussed, things that we might think are real problems. It's hard for people to get people to see them as such, because if it was as bad as you say, wouldn't we be talking about it more?
Yeah. Yeah. The thing with asylum interviews, the thing that was interesting to me about writing this piece about fairness is, to some extent, one thing we do in the book about LGBTQ asylum is, in the middle chapter on assessment, we just present the reader with 6 or 7 pages of questions that people have been asked during their asylum interview. and there's some extent to which it's like not that productive to add theory on top of those questions, because the questions are just so obviously awful that once you see them written down and they're kind of presented in a way that it's as if you're being asked the question. So it's meant to be very confronting. But then if you give that list to someone who's genuinely anti-immigrant, they're going to think, oh, well, that person deserves it, or we need to do this in order to catch free riders, or so there's a question
I think in the case of true racists, who are a much larger percentage of the population than people care to admit, the thing that's core is the racism, and any sort of factual or fairness claim is secondary. Like, it's mean to brown people. I'm going to retrofit my beliefs around that. There's not a coherent core to be had there.
Mm-hmm.
I do find what's emerged from this conversation quite interesting about, I'm not going to phrase this very well, but the sort of mismatch in morals that comes from people assuming that what we pay attention to is correct. If we're spending a lot of time talking about trans people, it must be because there's a lot of them, and say sex attacks in toilets are really, really common or something like that. It must be happening all the time. And if we're not talking about something like all of the awful things that happen in immigration systems, it must be because it's not that big a deal. I don't know what you'd call that, but that's kind of a through line I took away from a lot of this conversation.
Yeah.
And I don't know what even to do about that. I think just noticing a fact about the world.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, so I was looking at a paper this morning that came out just last year on this idea of emancipatory attention.
That's a nice phrase. That's way better than what I just said.
I only came across it earlier. So, so Marilyn Fry, who's a very famous feminist philosopher, had this idea that the epistemic aspects of injustice are root problems about attention, that we kind of fail to give attention to the right things, the right people, the right social contexts, and so the first thing that you need to do in order to kind of even out the moral terrain is to be paying attention to the right things, but maybe also the same things. There needs to be some set of shared attentional resources in order for us to even have a conversation, I think.
How do we do that, though? I mean, okay, there's a huge question to end with, but like to ground it in the refugee case, I started this by saying I like that your papers call our sort of moral and practical attention to the experience of the refugee as opposed to merely the concerns, practical or moral, of the host nation.
Mm-hmm.
How do we, I guess, decide? I mean, there's maybe one social justice approach which says you start with the most oppressed and the least privileged, and you look at their perspective. I'm not against that approach. It also feels slightly reductive to me, and like, how do you decide who's oppressed and not being privileged in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. Do you have any? I don't have an answer there. Like, how do we center our attention in ways that are likely to lead to better morality?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer to the question, but I think that is kind of the ethos of the book that I'm just trying to finish. Which, so the idea there is that LGBTQ people generally and refugees are both at this like horrendous point of like double backlash, that LGBTQ refugees are facing they're facing like homophobic, transphobic discrimination, but they're also in the midst of this kind of horrible anti-immigrant moment. But there's also a sense in which they're kind of theoretically marginalized as well. So people who talk about asylum, refuge, and migration so often have this kind of imagined idea of a refugee, and it's not doing justice to the kind of complexity out in the world. So what the book tries to do is shift our attention to say, okay, well, let's follow the LGBTQ refugee through the journey of displacement, through these different stages, and see whether the theoretical tools that we have are good theoretical tools, to understand their predicament. And it turns out that they're not. And what that means is that the shift in attention isn't just, let's look at this extra interesting, like, applied case as an additional thing. It's that focusing on something like LGBTQ displacement, or focusing on people who experience extreme forms of marginalization, it basically becomes kind of conceptually indispensable to think about those people. You have kind of impoverished theoretical tools without those people being centered. I do think there's space for a kind of disciplinary division of labor. Like, some people want to talk about the state. Sometimes I do talk about the state, take a kind of state level approach. Sometimes I flip to think about more interpersonal situations. And I think you just have to be moving between both of those things and not get stuck in one space.
I like that, yeah. And from the point of view of those of us who aren't academic specialists, it's kind of like a moral curiosity, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Like an openness to, let's think it through from a different perspective. Like, let's not, like I say, I don't want to judge people for being misled. I maybe judge people for, like, instinctively shying away from sources of information that might lead them to something uncomfortable or unfamiliar. That's the instinct you've got to kind of rise above, right?
Yeah, I would also say, not to shift the terrain too much, for, like, kind of focusing on the individual agent here, it might be a mistake. So, like, the not to talk about quote unquote the mainstream media, but the kind of the contemporary media landscape in Britain has an obsession with immigration. They're constantly talking
pathological
about, yeah, and like to the extent that, like, every day you get an update on the Daily Mail website about how many people have crossed over the channel. You get updates on people doing how much of the budget's being spent on asylum seeker hotels, how much money they get for lawyers, all this kind of stuff. And so, in a sense, in that context, you would come to believe that there must therefore be millions of pounds being spent, millions of people being let in, because otherwise, why would there be so much attention being paid to these people? So I think there are bigger things to blame, as well as a kind of failure of intellectual curiosity.
Oh yeah, for sure, it's both. Yeah. I'm just trying to think through why the middle are so unreachable on this. But yeah, I'm certainly not letting the Daily Mail
off the hook.
All right, what's the name of this book, by the way, that's coming out?
It's called The Way Out.
The Way Out. Okay, yeah. That sounds interesting. When is this out?
It's out in January 2026. So subject to us finishing it in 4 weeks' time, which hopefully will happen.
Do you feel optimistic or pessimistic that the debate around this will have gotten better or worse by that point?
I would be very surprised if it had gotten better.
Yeah.
I think there's a sense in which the only thing I can hope for, at least in the UK context, is that people are starting to get angry about the shape of Labour's policies and how much they're pandering to reform, and that maybe they'll figure out that, for every reform voter you pick up with one of those horrible videos, you alienate someone else to the Greens or the Lib Dems. And
I'm not even that sure they're picking up reform voters. I think you'll never match that bid, because the bid is fantastical. It's not based on anything real. Anyway, that is another story. Thank you so much for your time today. We mentioned the book. Is there anywhere else you'd like to direct listeners to follow you, like a Blue Sky or anything like that? Yeah,
I have a Blue Sky. I'm very new. I only came across a few months ago. I didn't realise everybody was hanging out there. So yeah, Blue Sky is the place to find me.
Cool. Rebecca, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.